Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. What I'm about to share with you tonight may challenge everything you've been hearing from mainstream media about the recent developments in the Ukraine peace negotiations. But stay with me, because understanding what's really happening here requires us to look beneath the surface, beyond the headlines, and examine the deeper economic and geopolitical forces at play. Let me start with a question that should trouble us all. Why would Vladimir Putin reject a peace deal that was supposedly crafted to end a nearly 4-year war? The answer, my friends, isn't as simple as the talking heads on cable news would have you believe. This past Tuesday, December 2nd, a 5-hour meeting took place in the Kremlin. On one side sat President Putin and his closest advisors. On the other, President Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and son-in-law Jared Kushner, carrying what they believed was a pathway to peace. By the time the meeting concluded, no breakthrough had been achieved. The Kremlin's foreign policy advisor called the talks useful and constructive, but admitted plainly that a compromise option was not found. Putin, rather than embracing this supposed olive branch from Washington, instead doubled down, warning Europe that Russia is ready for war if the continent wants one. Now, the conventional narrative would have you believe this is about Putin's irrationality, his war-mongering, his refusal to see reason. But that narrative is dangerously incomplete, and it's precisely the kind of oversimplification that has led the West into one strategic miscalculation after another. Let me take you back to the beginning of this conflict, because context matters. The United States and NATO believed they could provoke Russia into an invasion, then use that invasion to achieve multiple objectives, morally isolate Russia on the world stage, economically crush it through unprecedented sanctions, cause internal political collapse in Moscow, and reassert American hegemony at a moment when that hegemony was visibly declining. They believed Russia's economy, small and dependent on oil and gas exports, would crater. They predicted the ruble would collapse, that Russian GDP would drop by 30 to 40% or more, and that Putin's government would buckle under the pressure. Here's what actually happened. Western sanctions have failed spectacularly, not partially, not somewhat, but spectacularly. Russia's economy didn't collapse. The ruble stabilized. Russian oil and gas found new markets, particularly in China and India, countries representing billions of people now trading in currencies other than the dollar. The European Union, which depended heavily on Russian energy, found itself in an economic crisis far worse than anything Russia experienced. Germany's industrial base, built on cheap Russian gas, has been devastated. Inflation has soared across the West, and ordinary working people in America and Europe are the ones bearing the costs of this strategic miscalculation. But Washington refuses to acknowledge this reality. Instead, they've doubled down, pouring over $100 billion into Ukraine while their own infrastructure crumbles, while their own people struggle with health care costs, housing crises, and wage stagnation. This isn't just bad economics, it's a symptom of an empire in denial about its own decline. Now, let's talk about this so-called peace deal that Putin rejected. The original proposal contained 28 points heavily favoring Russian demands. It was revised down to 19 points after Ukrainian objections and European pushback. But here's the critical issue. Russia wants legally binding guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, constitutional neutrality enshrined in Ukrainian law, recognition of annexed territories, and the lifting of all Western sanctions. In other words, Russia wants Ukraine's total capitulation dressed up as a peace agreement. And what does Ukraine get in this scenario? The loss of territory, the surrender of sovereignty and security guarantees that aren't worth the paper they're printed on. President Zelensky has made clear that Ukraine's red lines remain non-negotiable. no concession of territories currently under Ukrainian control, and no surrender of national sovereignty. So why would Putin reject even discussions around a framework that already leaned heavily in Russia's favor? Because, my friends, Putin believes he's winning. He believes time is on his side. His military continues making incremental gains. Ukraine's energy infrastructure is being systematically destroyed. European unity is fracturing. And most importantly, the global balance of power is shifting in ways that favor Russia's long-term strategic position. This brings me to the elephant in the room that Washington desperately wants to ignore: China. This conflict has accelerated the rise of China and the BRICS nations as viable alternatives to Western economic dominance. Russia, pushed into China's orbit by Western sanctions, has become increasingly integrated into an emerging economic bloc that represents the majority of the world's population. India, Brazil, South Africa, and dozens of other nations are watching carefully, and many are hedging their bets, maintaining relationships with both the West and this new BRICS Plus alignment. The United States finds itself in a trap of its own making. It cannot sustain funding Ukraine indefinitely. Its European allies are economically exhausted and politically divided. The sanctions regime that was supposed to break Russia has instead fractured the Western-dominated financial system. And Trump's new administration, eager for a foreign policy victory, is discovering that Putin has no incentive to give them one. Let me be absolutely clear about something. This isn't about defending Putin or Russian militarism. This is about understanding the material conditions and economic forces that shape geopolitical behavior. When we ignore those forces, when we reduce complex international conflicts to simplistic narratives about good guys and bad guys, we make catastrophic policy errors that cost real lives and real treasure. The tragedy here is that Ukraine and its people are caught in the middle of this great power competition. Ukrainian cities are being destroyed. Ukrainian lives are being lost. Ukrainian refugees number in the millions. And all of this suffering is being instrumentalized by larger powers pursuing their own strategic objectives. Washington claims to support Ukrainian sovereignty, but it has consistently sidelined Europe from peace negotiations and appears willing to pressure Kiev into accepting terms that serve American interests rather than Ukrainian ones. Meanwhile, the American working class is being told to tighten their belts, that there's no money for health care, no money for education, no money for infrastructure, but somehow there are endless billions for weapons shipments to Ukraine. This is class warfare disguised as foreign policy. The costs of this conflict are being socialized, placed on the shoulders of ordinary people, while defense contractors and the military, industrial complex profit handsomely. Putin understands all of this. He understands that Western leaders have tied their political careers to this conflict and cannot easily back down without appearing weak. He understands that the longer this drags on, the more the economic pain falls on European and American populations rather than Russian ones. He understands that China benefits from every day this conflict continues, as it further decouples the global economy from dollar dominance. And he understands that Trump, despite his bombast about ending the war quickly, has very few cards to play. So when Putin rejects a peace proposal, he's not being irrational. He's making a calculated strategic decision based on the actual balance of forces, not the fantasies that dominate thinking in Washington. He's willing to wait, to continue grinding forward militarily, to watch Europe fracture and American resolve weaken, because he believes that time will bring him better terms than anything he'd get right now. This should frighten us, not because Putin is some uniquely evil figure, but because it means this war will continue. More Ukrainian cities will be destroyed, more lives will be lost, more resources that could address human needs will be devoted to destruction. And the fundamental problems driving this conflict, the contradictions of global capitalism, the decline of American hegemony, the rise of multipolarity, none of these will be resolved on the battlefield. What's needed, desperately needed, is a fundamental reorientation of how we think about security and international relations. We need to move beyond the zero-sum thinking that dominates both Moscow and Washington. We need to recognize that sustainable peace requires addressing legitimate security concerns on all sides, not imposing victors' terms. We need to acknowledge that the unipolar moment of American dominance has ended, and that trying to recreate it through force is both futile and dangerous. But most importantly, we need to understand that the working people of America, Europe, Russia, and Ukraine have far more in common with each other than they do with the elites making these decisions. The costs of war are borne by ordinary people, the soldiers who fight, the civilians who suffer, the workers who see their living standards decline. The benefits accrue to a narrow stratum of weapons manufacturers, energy corporations, and political leaders who use crisis to consolidate their power. Until we build movements capable of challenging this system, capable of demanding that resources be devoted to human welfare rather than military competition, we will continue to lurch from crisis to crisis. Putin's rejection of this peace deal is just one more symptom of a deeper disease, the disease of capitalism itself, a system that generates conflict and competition rather than cooperation and peace. So as you watch the headlines in the coming days and weeks, as you hear politicians and pundits explain why we must continue supporting this war, ask yourself, who benefits? Who pays the price? And is there another way forward that doesn't require endless bloodshed in service of great power politics? These are the questions we must grapple with. These are the conversations we must have. Because the future of international relations, the future of global security, and frankly, the future of human civilization itself, depends on our ability to move beyond the failed paradigms that have brought us to this dangerous moment. Thank you for your time, and thank you for thinking critically about these vital issues. The establishment doesn't want you to ask these questions. They want you to accept their narratives uncritically. But you're here because you know better. You know that understanding the economic foundations of geopolitical conflict is essential to building a more just and peaceful world. The rejection of this peace deal isn't the end of the story. It's a chapter in a much longer struggle over what kind of world we will inhabit in the 21st century. Will it be a world of endless military competition and capitalist exploitation? Or can we build something different, something better? That choice, ultimately, is up to us. Thank you.